Okay, so my name is Erin Piner, and I just want to thank you guys so much for the honor and the privilege that it is to be one of your guides for the next couple of weeks as we see what God is saying to us here in the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you'll remember from last week, we kind of talked about our 3 targets, right? So we talked about that transition from going how we learn the Word of God to how we live the will of God. Right, and our 3 targets there were our head, our heart, and our hands. Okay, so I want us to whenever we're coming to the Word, I want us to think of that as our goal, like our head, our heart, our hands. We want to understand, we want to experience, and we want to obey the Word. That said, I want you to imagine if you were a great archer, right, and you know where your targets are, you got 20/20 vision, you got perfect hand-eye coordination, and then you realize that you have been given the world's weirdest bow. Like you don't know if you're holding it forward or backward. You can't even pull the string thingy back. I'm a professional archer, so I know that's called a string thingy. But you have no idea how to wield this weapon. If there's ever been a wily weapon in the Word, it is the book of Ecclesiastes, right? So I'm assuming all of you read and memorized Ecclesiastes this week. It's a complicated book, isn't it? Right? It's a little hard to understand. It's not as overt as it could possibly be. So even other Old Testament scholars, other than us, they also think that this is a really difficult book. So my favorite Old Testament scholar, he actually said, Ecclesiastes may be the most difficult biblical book to interpret and to teach. And he listed all of these reasons, right? So he said you have a number of different communicators, right? So you have the guy who's writing it, but then you have the guy who's speaking as well. And then he said you also have this strange, we don't really know when it was written, and we don't know where it was written. So for example, in the book of Daniel, right, we know it's written in Babylon. So whenever they're being forced to, try to worship pagan gods, like we understand that's happening in a pagan culture, so that makes sense to us. And then when we see that, there's all this tension and all this transition, we understand that it's written as they're being transitioned from their homeland into exile. So we understand all of the tension and all of the heartache in that book because we know the setting and we know the timing. And then we come to Ecclesiastes and we have no idea when any of that stuff is. I mean, I have some guesses, which are probably correct, so I'll tell you those tonight. But in general, it's a hot debate, even amongst other Old Testament scholars. In addition, we don't know why the book is in the Bible necessarily. So I want to read you John 20. You can turn there if you want, but you don't need to. John 20, verse 31. This is the book of John. He says, "But these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So now we know why John wrote his book, right? It's so that we can believe Jesus is the Son of God and believe in his name. Thank you, John. That's very helpful. Now when we're reading, we know exactly what he wants us to get from this book. Ecclesiastes, you open it up, and he's like, I don't even know if there's any meaning to life. And then he just kind of sits in that for a while. And you're like, that's not helpful at all. So once again, we don't have a purpose statement, the setting, the time, the genre, even the way it's written. Sometimes it's poetry, sometimes it's prose, sometimes he's so dark and pessimistic, and then all of a sudden he's happy, and he's like, dude, just chill and eat something. And then he has this unfounded optimism. It's like this huge mood swing of a book. Right, so, and I think that maybe the hardest thing about the book of Ecclesiastes is that in the midst of it all, it seems to lack good news. I mean, even in other Old Testament books, right, you have Genesis, and I mean, you don't even get too many chapters in where, you see this guy and the serpent is going to hurt him some way, but he's going to crush his head, and there's some hope there. And Isaiah, you have the suffering servant, right? And almost every Old Testament book, there's this really overt picture of Christ. And then you get to Ecclesiastes, and he's like, when we die, we might just be like animals. And it's like, I don't even know what to do with that, right? So once again, we see the purpose, the good news, all of that. It's a weird book in that it's hard to find anything in the book that seems like other biblical books. But my hope is that by the end of tonight, I can prove to you that this book is maybe not as complicated as it seems, which wouldn't be hard. And then I also want to prove to you that there is hope in this book. There's light at the end of the very dark tunnel, and we can leave this book with joy and with peace and with hope. It might be a darker shade of hope, but sometimes you need a darker shade of hope because life gets really difficult. So I'm going to walk you through some of the logistics of our weapons so that we'll know a little bit better about how to hit our targets. So let's talk about, first of all, just how to find this book because it's a little hard to find. If you're new to Bible reading, by the way, we are so excited that you are joining us. Welcome. So if you open up to like the center third of your Bible and then start scrolling to the right, you'll see a really big book called Psalm. And then keep going, that has 150 chapters. Keep going right, you'll hit Proverbs, that has 31 chapters. Then you're going to hit Ecclesiastes. So you can remember PPE, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, which may or may not be helpful, but it's helpful to me. So PPE. All right, and then, so first thing I want us to look into is the author. So I'm going to read the first two verses. So Ecclesiastes, the big number is the chapter, and then the little numbers are the verses if you're new to Bible reading. So chapter 1, big number 1, and then we're going to read the first two verses. So it says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Okay, so we already see from these first two verses, it looks like there's two communicators, right? So you have this author who's talking about the preacher, and then you have the preacher himself. Okay, so the author, pretty much everybody agrees, is anonymous and may even be the same person as the preacher. It's not at all weird in Old Testament culture for them to write about themselves as if from a different perspective. That happens in several books. So the author may be the same person as the preacher, but we see a couple of things about the preacher. Now, if you had to guess, the preacher is the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So who does that sound like to you? Solomon, right? Okay, so if you think it's Solomon, me and you can still be friends. Okay, there's not going to be any hard feelings there. But I do want us to at least be aware of another theory of some people who don't necessarily think that it actually is Solomon. And it's not because they think that the Bible is lying. So basically, you have this idea that someone could be writing about a Solomonic-like character. So, for example, if 2,500 years from now, in the Middle East, some women picked up an old piece of paper and it said these words, "Alexander Hamilton. My name is Alexander Hamilton. And there's a million things I haven't done, but just wait." Now, tell me, who are they going to think wrote that piece of paper? Alexander Hamilton, right? And that's not because they're dummies, it's because it says, "I am Alexander Hamilton." So that's kind of a giveaway. But then if they actually started investigating into, ancient American culture, they would realize there is a guy named Alexander Hamilton, but the way he writes is actually really different from the way that this guy writes. So who wrote these words? Does anyone know? Lin-Manuel Miranda. I try to say that without my southern accent. I'm sure I butcher it. If I see him tomorrow, I'll apologize. But yes, so that's his name, right? And he wrote this play, and it was on Broadway, and some of us are too lowbrow to see it on Broadway, so we just saw it on Disney, right? Okay, so what he did was he was trying to capture an Alexander Hamilton-like persona. So, but I mean, you can tell immediately it's not actually Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton didn't rap quite as much, right? But that said, as we're interpreting and as we are coming to that piece of literary work, we should treat it as if it is the real Alexander Hamilton. We should approach it because we know even if he's not the real Alexander Hamilton, he's trying to portray himself as that man in order to teach us some things about life. So, because of the mood of the book, I actually think that this was probably not written during Solomon's reign, right? So when Solomon was king, like Israel, man, they were rich and everything was going well. Not a lot of wars or battles going on. Lots of money. Everything was great. But when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it just seems like there are a lot of problems going on, right? When you look at the mood, there's death and injustice and tyranny and transition and confusion. It actually sounds a lot more like the exile in context than it does the days of Solomon. So I think because of the mood, a lot of people think it was actually an exilic book or a book written about the time of the exile, kind of like Daniel, right? But also because of the language, right? So like I said, the first Alexander Hamilton didn't rap. So it seems like there's a little bit of rapping in this book, if you will, right? So it just seems to have some language that seems further along than the day of Solomon. So either way, though, what everyone agrees on is that this guy is in a bad place, right? And he is speaking to a group of people. So Kohelet is what he is called in the Hebrew. So I want us to get used to speaking Hebrew, right? So here we go. We're going to learn a couple of Hebrew phrases. It's going to be fun. Okay, you can like whip it out at the coffee shop with your girlfriends. Okay, so Kohelet. Kohelet. Okay, now say it with some stuff in your throat, like Kohelet. Yeah, I'm kidding. That's not even how you say it. I just wanted to hear you do that. Okay, yeah. So Kohelet is what he's called, and it literally means assembly speaker. Right, so that's the preacher or the teacher is Kohelet. Now, as we look at the fact that there are these two different authors, it's the one writing and then the one preaching, or what's his name? Kohelet, yeah, the Kohelet. So as we look at these two different guys, we realize that they also have two different audiences, right? Two different communicators have two different audiences. So the author, if you look at Ecclesiastes 12:12, he says, "My son, beware of anything beyond these," and he's talking about these wise words in this book. So it seems like an older man writing to a younger man. So the book is actually written by an older man writing to a younger man. But when you zoom into the book and then you see what's going on in there, it's a preacher or the Kohelet, and he's actually talking to a group of younger men. Now, we do actually have a lot of information about these guys. In chapter 8, verse 3, he gives them advice on how to deal with kings. So apparently they're pretty well off. They're hanging out with kings. They need advice for that. In chapter 5, 10 through 17, he gives advice on how to handle all of this great wealth. So these guys probably have some money. And then later on, we see that he warns them against those seductive women, okay? He's not being sexist. He doesn't think all women are seductive. Okay, he's just talking to a group of young men, right? Like if you were counseling a group of young women, you would say, girls, you better watch out because some guys are only about that thing, and you would warn them. It's not because you think all men are horrible people. You're just speaking to young girls and they need to have an eye out for those kinds of guys. So he's like, hey, there's some chicks out there and, so be careful about that, right? So that just shows us once again, we're pretty sure these are wealthy young men in the Jewish culture. So if you want the fancy word for that, it's Jewish aristocracy. Okay, if you say it with a British accent, it sounds cooler. I can't do that. Okay, so that's who the author and the speaker are. Now I'm going to come over here and see if you guys can see this. Okay, this is a vapor coming out of this. If you can't see the vapor, just imagine a vapor. All right, so as you're reading the book of Ecclesiastes, you need to have three kind of key terms in mind, if you will. Now, let's read together in chapter 3, verses 20 to 21. I'm going to wait for you to turn there. You can turn there in your workbooks, or you can turn there in a real Bible. Not that that's not a real Bible. None of these are actually scrolls, I guess. Right? So chapter 3, verse 20. Okay, this is what he says. This is some weird stuff in this book. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of beast goes down into the earth? Okay, does that sound like something a preacher should say in church? No, he's like, I don't even know if people go to heaven, and I'm not even, we might just be like animals, right? So that's a weird thing. I want us to also look in chapter 6, verse 3. Chapter 6, verse 3. All right, he says, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are so many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. Okay, so even if this guy has this amazing life, like a couple things go wrong, life isn't even worth living at all. Let me show you one more weird thing that he says in this book. Chapter 7, verse 16. Be not overly righteous. Right, guys? You've just been really righteous. You need to chill out with the righteousness stuff. And do not make yourself too wise. Right? Why should you destroy yourself? Okay? So don't be righteous. Don't be wise. You're just going to mess up everything, right? So once again, this is a pretty weird book, but as we try to decipher how on earth to interpret, how on earth to read this book, because we believe that this book is the Word of God, so it must be really important, whatever's going on in here. We have a little cheat sheet in the first 3 verses, okay? So when we look at the first 3 verses, we're going to see one of the keywords. We already learned that. What's that? Kohelet, assembly speaker, okay? The second one I want us to learn is, it's actually in verse 2. My translation says vanity of vanities. Okay, does anyone else have a different translation? Meaningless. Okay, so just for a second, not hating on the translators, they are way cooler than I will ever be, but literally speaking, the word is not vanity, nor is it meaningless, okay? This is the word. Vapor. This is actually what the word is. Some other translations are breath or smoke. Breath, smoke, vapor. That's actually what this word means. So I want us to hear that again. Vapor of vapors, says the preacher. Vapor of vapors. Everything is smoke, right? Okay, so I want you to take 10 seconds at your table. I want you to try to come up with just 2 or 3 adjectives, description words, that you would use to describe a vapor or smoke, okay? 10 seconds. You guys on the camera, do that too. All right, 10 seconds, adjectives for vapor. Go ahead. Okay, this table, you guys can continue to think if you want. This table, what are some adjectives you have for vapor? Transient. Ooh, okay, 3 syllables. Aren't you fancy? Okay, transient. Good, excellent. Okay, so and so it's temporary, it's temporal, right? It's coming and going, and we can't quite grab a hold of it. Excellent. Okay, what else do we have for vapor? Mist. Okay, right. So when I'm thinking of a mist, it's foggy, right? It's hard to see through. I mean, you can see through it, but you can't really see through it, right? Excellent. Vapor, mist, transient. What else do we got? Steam. Okay, excellent. Same thing, so kind of with a mist, except for maybe in a different context there. All right, one more. Give me one more from the back table. Loose. Yeah, you can't grab a hold of this stuff, right? And even if you did reach for it and you try to grab it, you wouldn't have anything in your hand, right? And in that way, it's kind of puzzling. It's a bit enigmatic, right? So that's how he says life is. One adjective I thought of, too, is, in a way, it's beautiful, right? I mean, when you see a vapor, that's why it's a fancy decorating thing, right? It's pretty, right? Vapors, even though it's puzzling and it's frustrating and you can't see, but you kind of can see, and it's something, but then when you grab it, it's nothing, and it's puzzling, it's confusing, but when you back up at the end of the day, there's just something mysteriously beautiful about it as well, right? That's what the Kohelet is saying life is like. It's transient, right? It's there, but and then it's gone, and it's puzzling, and you try to grab it, and there's nothing really there, even though it seems like it is sometimes, right? So every time you read vanity or meaningless, I want you to think hevel. All right, so that's our second Hebrew word for the night. All right, so let's hevel, Hevel, even though they didn't actually have those letters, but hevel. Okay, so how do you say preacher? Kohelet. And then how do you say vapor? Hevel. Good. Okay, so that's all Hebrew we're doing, actually maybe for the rest of the time. But those are really important because those are serious themes we see. Now, another theme that we see in verse 3 right here, it says, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils? Where? Under the sun. Okay, I want you to underline that, under the sun, put a little star by it. You can draw a little sun by it if you're creative and special, right? So under the sun, that's going to also be a huge theme throughout this book. So the whole time you have the Kohelet, he's talking about life and how it's hevel, and the whole time he's going to be saying it's under the sun, under the sun. Now, this is an important interpretive point. What he means by under the sun is without God, okay? So when he's talking about life under the sun, as if nothing's above the sun, right? We're only talking about strictly everything under the sun. That means without reference to God. So in a way, let me ask, if life is only under the sun, is it meaningless? If there's no God, is pain even worth enduring? Right? So in this way, we're starting to see what he's saying. Yeah, man, if there's no God in your world, there is no purpose in your world. So now we can begin to understand the philosophical experiment that is the book of Ecclesiastes. He says, hey, what if we do this? What if we create a world just under the sun, nothing above the sun, no God, and then we begin to experiment with that world? What if we come over here and we lean into money in a world without God? We'll find some pleasure, but ultimately it'll fall through. What if we lean into, a career? And he goes on all of these philosophical explorations, but at the end, they all end up falling through, and he just ends up being even darker than he was before. Now, I don't want us to just think it's a distant philosophical experiment. Okay, this is real wrestling as well. He's actually experiencing this as he goes. So don't think of him as aloof and distant. This is really a man wrestling with the meaning of life when there's a felt absence of God. Okay, so there's a real emotional felt absence of God. This is not just an intellectual experiment, which is why he says some pretty emotional things throughout the book, right? So at the end of the day, we do realize that this man, he does believe in God, right? If you look at chapter 3, verse 11. So chapter 3, verse 11, he says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's hearts. Okay, so he sees that there is a God. He does make everything beautiful, and there even is eternity, and God's put it in man's hearts. Down in verse 17 of chapter 3, we see, I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked. So if somebody asks you, does the Kohelet believe in God? What's the correct answer? Yes. Now, is the Kohelet being really honest about the felt absence of God in the world? Yes. Okay, so he does believe in God. He's not a heretic. God generally doesn't let heretics write scripture. It's kind of like a policy he has. But he is wrestling. This is real wrestling going on. Okay, so this is what I want us to begin to ask ourselves as we continue throughout this experiment. What is going on in the book as far as we are concerned? Okay, so I want us to go all the way to chapter 12. Chapter 12. Like when we read this guy, are we just supposed to go, ooh, he's really emotional. Don't be emotional like him, because then you say crazy things. Or are we supposed to go, hey, this is awesome. We should all do this and just have crazy prayers like this all the time. Like what are we supposed to actually do with this book? Well, in chapter 12, the author of the book takes back the microphone from the Kohelet. He takes back the microphone from the preacher, and he gives his own commentary. He summarizes the sermon, and he gives us some hints on how we should read it. So chapter 12, verse 9, I'll start reading at verse 9. Besides being wise, okay, so he's wise, the preacher, the Kohelet, also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The Kohelet sought to find words of delight and uprightly wrote words of truth. Okay, the words of the wise are like goads. That's important. Remember that. And like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. One shepherd. Okay. So does anyone know what a goad is? Okay, I'm assuming we don't have a lot of shepherdesses in here, being that we're in a city, but I didn't know this either. But apparently, if you're a shepherd, you have this really sharp stick, and it's not meant to harm the sheep, but it is most definitely meant to hurt the sheep. Okay, so you got a sheep, and it's all like, I think I'm going to go eat some poison, and then you like stab it with this sharp stick, and it's like, okay, fine, I won't eat poison, right? So when sheep are about to like run off of a cliff or hurt themselves, you hit them with a stick instead. So instead of being seriously harmed, they just experience some pain that actually ends up saving them in the long run. And the author here, he says, yeah, that sermon you just heard, it was pretty rough, it was pretty dark. It's kind of like a goad. Like if you learn to pray like that, if you learn to wrestle with God like that, I mean, it's painful, right? Crying those tears are hard tears to cry, but in the long run, it's actually going to be better for you, right? In the long run, we're going to learn how to spiritually heal and how to avoid spiritual harm. It also said it's the goad of a shepherd, right? Now, in the Old Testament, there are actually several prophets and even bad prophets who are likened to shepherds, but who's the ultimate shepherd in the Old Testament? Anybody? Psalm 23? God, the Lord is your shepherd. So in my Bible, the translators, it's actually a capital S shepherd. I think they did a fantastic job there. He's saying at the end of the day, they are given by one shepherd. These are the words of God. As crazy as they may be, the author thinks that they are God's words and that they're like goads. They're hard to hear, they're hard to understand, but they're going to help us out in the long run. So as we go through this experiment, I want us to consider whether or not this is even okay, right? So some of us grew up in houses where you had this insecure dad and you can never ask any questions, right? When dad says do something, you shut your mouth and you do it. You don't ask why, you don't do any of that stuff, right? And some of us can think of God in that way, right? If God says do something, you don't show emotion, you don't ask questions, you don't ask why, you shut your mouth and you do it, because God is an insecure, angry father who really doesn't care how you feel, okay? Now, I think that this book is really trying to shatter that glass. He's going, wow, God is anything but insecure. Another thing about that kind of dad is he can't read your mind. So you really can sit at the dinner table and put on this smile and trick your dad into that. But God already knows what you're thinking. He already hears your thoughts. So he's like, I already hear your doubts. Why don't you just bring them to me? Right? You're already wrestling. Just come wrestle out here in the light. You're already wrestled. Come wrestle with me. Right? This is God allowing us, as our curriculum writer said, to be fiercely human. He's allowing us to be depraved. He's allowing us to be sinful. He's allowing us to be stupid. He's like, that's fine that you're sinful and stupid. I already knew that from eternity past. Just come be sinful and stupid in my arms. That's what he wants from us. He wants us to wrestle and to fight and to cry and to ask questions with him. More than he wants our obedience and more than he wants our understanding, he wants our hearts. And this book helps us to take all of the hurt and the pain and the confusion and take our hearts and just give it to God as black as it may be. Because it's there that he will then take it and he will heal it. Right? This book is allowing us to be human in front of God. Right? And we know this because God realizes we live in a fallen world. I mean, you read the book of Proverbs, right? And it says, well, if you work hard, you'll make a lot of money. And then 2020 comes up. And it's like all these hardworking people just lost everything in the stock market. Right? Or, Proverbs generally, well, if you exercise and eat well, you won't get sick. And then all of a sudden we got 30-year-olds dying of COVID, even though they did everything they were supposed to do, right? Proverbs says, well, generally speaking in life, if you do what's right, you'll reap the reward of that. And then you get to Ecclesiastes, and it's like, yeah, except for that one time when that's not what happened, right? Except for that one time, and I don't understand it, and I want answers now. And listen, we know that this is okay to do. We know even if we had perfect faith, we would still wrestle with God. We know that because the darkest, loudest, most agonizing why that was ever screamed in the Bible was screamed from a cross. Why have you forsaken me? Jesus wrestled with God at the darkest time of his life, where he had been betrayed, where he was shamed, where he was misunderstood, where there was confusion and hurt and injustice, the worst of injustices that this world has ever seen. And Jesus doesn't hang on the cross and say, don't worry, everyone, have hope. He hangs on the cross and he says, why, God? So we realize that even with perfect faith, we can ask God why. We can wrestle in the dark. I know some of you are here and you are asking why. You're asking why on earth your husband left you. You're asking why God let you get to that place, and you know it was your fault, but man, it was hard, and you messed up, and you cheated on your husband, and things are falling apart. And you don't know why that happened. Some of you don't know why God let you have that miscarriage or that abortion. Some of you don't know why God let that happen to you when you were just a little girl. Some of you don't know why you are in your 30s and 40s and you're still single and you just feel unchosen and you don't know why. This book is saying, take your why to God. He wants your why because he wants your heart and he wants you. And God is saying, if the only way you can come at me is with clenched fist, then let's fight. Let's do this. He's not scared. He's a big boy, right? The only way you can talk to him is with a bunch of doubts and questions. He leans in. He says, come on, let's do this, right? God's not scared of your doubt and your stupidity and your sin. He is more than comfortable with this. He dealt with it already at the cross, and now it's just a matter of maintenance, right? If he was going to back out from dealing with us, it would have been at the cross. When Jesus was sweating blood in the garden, and he says, is there any way we could rearrange the system? Is there any other cup? Is there any way to do this? That would have been the time where God would have said, yeah, actually, let's not deal with these people. They're not worth it. But he didn't. Jesus went and he died. So if Jesus was willing to die for us and have the flesh ripped off of his back for us, and if Jesus had conquered sin and death and hell in the most ultimate way already, don't you realize that he wants to conquer sin and death and hell in the small ways that are the daily questions of our life? This is an invitation to wrestle with God. If the only way he can get his arms around you is by wrestling, he's game. So this is a book that welcomes that. I want us to realize as we're walking through this book that although it's a dark book and it's a difficult book, that at the end of the day it is for our good, right? As he does these philosophical experiments and he leans into these different hopes that people have, hope in money, hope in a career, hope in family, and they all come tumbling down throughout the whole book. This is him wanting to strip us away of any hope that we have that is outside of God, right? I want you to imagine if we were all little old ladies, and we're just going through a hall, and we have this amazing, strong, loving helper who is helping us get down that hall. But then we see a splintered cane, and we let him go, and we start leaning on that splintered cane. Right? We all do this. We start leaning on hope and money, or hope and, if you're me, you lean on your own hope, your ability to plan things, right? Which, being that I'm not omniscient, it never works out as well as I want it to. But right, we're leaning on all of these things that aren't God, and we let go of God, and we start leaning on things. In this book, the Kohelet comes up, and he puts his arm around us, and he kicks that cane out from under us. And he watches us start to fall until we panic and realize we have nothing left in life but God, which is a really good place to be. Because when you have nothing else but God, you reach out for God. And he's always happy. He's always there with his hand open to hold you. So as we go through this book, I want you to kind of think of it as a metal detector, if you will, right? You go to the airport and they wave that wand over you, and then every time that happens, it always gets to my watch, and it's like beep, beep, and oh, I forgot to take off my watch, I'm sorry, right? And then it gets somewhere, oh, okay, yeah, I have metal on my shoe, I'm sorry. And you didn't even realize you had all this metal on you until there's someone rolling their eyes and waving the wand, like, why can't you read the sign? I do this a million times a day, right? So that person, which is always a lovely person, right? So when that happens, though, what we're supposed to do is Kohelet is waving this wand over you, and you go, I didn't even realize I was putting hope in money until I just walked on that experiment with him and realized that if all my money were gone tomorrow, it would hurt a little bit more than I thought it would, right? So I want you to think of this as just walking through that metal detector. And when you hear a beep, that's good news. That's God working. That's God wanting to take away one more splintered cane so that you'll have nothing but him left at the end of the day. So you'll be totally leaning on God. So as we read through the book of Ecclesiastes, I want us to realize there is much hope in the book of Ecclesiastes, because in wrestling in the dark, we wrestle with God. And as we reach out and look for answers, maybe we don't find all of the answers, but we find God. And he is much better than any answer. So for now we wrestle, but we wrestle with God until Jesus returns, and then the smoke clears. And then, for eternity, we won't need books to show us all of our idols, because we will love God perfectly. That's the hope that we're working toward. Let me pray for us. God, we come to this book, and we come fully aware of the fact that this is complicated, and it's messy, and it's dark. And God, even as I come to this book again, I just want to open my heart right now. I want to open my heart and my life for you to show me where the idols are, maybe idols that I don't even know about. God, I want to pray for these ladies as we're taking this journey together, that you would just strip away any hope that we have that is outside of you. God, I ask for these women who don't know how intimate you can be, how close that relationship can be, how real that relationship with you can be. God, I ask that they would go from finding a distant commander, God, that they are only trying to obey, to finding an intimate shepherd who is willing to hold them and maybe hit them with a goat every once in a while when they need it. God, I ask that we would leave this book with great hope, with everything taken away except for our hope in you and except for our love in you. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen. Hey, ladies, this week your homework is going to be week 1 in your workbooks.